The Secretary of State is, of course, also the Minister for Women and Equalities. Is she embarrassed at the lack of gender balance on the Department of Education's board? And can she explain what steps she will take to rectify this situation, which does nothing to advance the cause of women or equality? In 2014, the Scottish Association for Mental Health, which is Scotland's leading mental health charity, published research which found that 98% of their service users said their mental health had deteriorated as a direct result of welfare reform. Further research this year by the same charity in the facility they run in my constituency at Redhall Walled Garden confirmed that benefit sanctions have been detrimental to the mental health of service users there. What steps will her government take to address the adverse effects of benefit sanctions on those with mental health problems? Can the Minister confirm whether the proposed Bill of Rights will grant all those living in the UK the same levels of protection, or whether there will be different levels of rights protection for different categories of person, depending on whether they are a UK citizen, an EU or a non-EU citizen? At Justice Questions on the 23rd of June, the Secretary of State said that human rights are a reserved matter under the devolution settlement. At a debate in Westminster Hall on the 30th of June, I urged the UK Government to reconsider that position, having regard to the precise terms of the Scotland Act. Can the Minister now confirm that his advisers have had the opportunity to study Schedule 5 of the 1998 Act over the recess, and will he now accept that human rights are not listed there as a reserved matter, and that therefore, if his government wished to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights, he will require first to consult the Scottish Parliament in terms of the Sewell Convention? Mr. Speaker, employment tribunal fees are an additional pressure upon people who have been relieved of their employment in inappropriate circumstances, and they create a very real restriction on access to justice for those who are vulnerable. The Group Maternity Action have said that since the introduction of employment tribunal fees, there has been a 40% drop in claims for pregnancy-related detriment or dismissal. Why doesn't the Government follow the example of the Scottish Government and commit to scrapping employment tribunal fees? The Minister says that the Government takes a markedly different view on tribunal fees from my honourable friend, the member for Cumbernauld. However, when the Justice Committee published their review of court and tribunal fees earlier this year, their excellent chairperson, the honourable member for Bromley and Chislehurst, who of course is a backbencher of the Minister's party, said, and I quote, "Where there is conflict between the objectives of achieving full cost recovery and preserving access to justice, the latter must prevail. Access to justice must prevail." Does the Minister agree with this statement?
Minister.
Yes.
Across the United Kingdom, many banks are accelerating their closure of local branches, with adverse effects on vulnerable and older people and adverse effects on the high street. The Royal Bank of Scotland is closing down branches across Scotland, including Juniper Green and Chesser in my constituency. Local convenience stores are taking the strain, processing bills and often facing exorbitant bank charges for the privilege of doing that. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can realise a situation where banking across the UK services customers and the real economy? The Green Investment Bank employs 55 employees out of the head office in my constituency of Edinburgh South West. When it was set up in 2012, the then Business Secretary Vince Cable said, and I quote, "Edinburgh has a lot going for it, both in terms of asset management and finance sectors, and also its proximity to green energy activity." He also said that choosing Edinburgh supported what he described as the wider narrative of binding Scotland into the UK in the run-up to the independence referendum. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss how such promises can now be delivered to those 55 employees who work at the head office in my constituency? Called Cuts That Hurt, Amnesty International have highlighted the devastating impact that legal aid cuts have had on vulnerable groups in England. Amnesty concluded that these legal aid cuts have decimated access to justice. What steps is she taking to review the impact of the Government's cuts to legal aid in England and Wales? 2013, legal aid funding has not been available in England and Wales for many immigration cases, including family reunion cases. And this means that unaccompanied or separated children making applications to stay in the UK have to do so on their own without legal assistance. Given Amnesty's findings, will he follow the example of the Scottish Government and provide legal advice and assistance to vulnerable individuals such as these children who have to navigate what is a very complex immigration system?
Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Common Travel Area can continue to operate between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, a country that's a member of the EU with its own rules on immigration, then why couldn't it operate between Scotland and the rest of the UK if Scotland stays in the single market when the rest of the UK leaves?
The Common Travel Area is of benefit to the whole of the UK, including Scotland.
Earlier this month, I met with UN officials in New York to discuss human rights issues, and they were appalled to hear that the British Prime Minister had said that at the next general election she would be campaigning to withdraw the United Kingdom from the European Convention on Human Rights. Can I take what the Minister has just said in response to the honourable gentleman behind me as a guarantee that this abhorrent commitment to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights is not going to be in the Tory party manifesto for 8th June? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights guarantees the right to respect for family and private life. The Equality and Human Rights Commission have written to the Government saying that the controversial rape clause raises serious issues under Article 8. Can we assume from the Government's insistence on proceeding with the rape clause that Article 8 is one of the rights guaranteed by the ECHR which they find inconvenient?
Anna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, in June, the Secretary of State assured this House that, in his view, human rights were a reserved matter. However, last week he told the House of Lords Constitutional Affairs Committee that legislation in regard to human rights is neither reserved nor devolved. Does he therefore now accept that any legislation repealing the Human Rights Act and introducing a British Bill of Rights will require the consent of the Scottish Parliament? And is he aware that there is no question of such consent being given? The long-awaited consultation on the Government's plans to scrap the Human Rights Act will not now be published until the new year. Can the Secretary of State confirm when he intends to bring forward a British Bill of Rights? And will he commit to ensuring there is full consultation on these proposals and that adequate time will be given to consider and answer any responses to the consultation? He says that he and the Government want to stay in the ECHR, but we know that he wants to leave the European Union. The Home Secretary told us yesterday that she wants to leave the ECHR, but she wants to remain in the European Union. Should we understand that this Government is as divided on the question of ECHR membership as it is on the question of EU membership?
Run away and hide.
We've been asking for a long time on this side of the House when the Government are going to bring forward their consultation on repeal of the Human Rights Act. Does he understand that the Home Secretary's statements yesterday have caused particular concern in Scotland? Because in Scotland, the European Convention of Human Rights is embedded in the devolution settlement, as it is in the other devolved administrations. And does he appreciate that the ECHR could never be withdrawn from without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, and there is no question of that consent ever being given? I'm very grateful to the Attorney-General for what he has said so far, but his response and the absence of the Home Secretary simply will not do. There is confusion here. Less than an hour ago, the Junior Minister for Human Rights assured me that the Government have no plans to withdraw from the ECHR. But yesterday in her speech, the Home Secretary said that withdrawal from the ECHR was a must. Why is she not here to answer this urgent question? Does she not realise that what she said yesterday has caused grave concern across these islands, and particularly in Scotland? I can assure honourable members on both sides of the House that the unity and purpose missing from the Conservative and Labour parties are present in the Scottish National Party in relation to the ECHR and human rights, and they're also present in a majority of the elected members of the last Scottish Parliament, who made it very clear that under no circumstances would they ever consent to a repeal of the Human Rights Act. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, the ECHR is hardwired into the Scotland Act. Everything that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament do is governed by the ECHR. And I can assure the British Government that, given the composition of the last Scottish Parliament and the likely composition of the next Scottish Parliament, there is no question of the Scottish Parliament ever giving its consent to Britain withdrawing from the ECHR. Does the Home Secretary not realise that if Britain were to attempt to withdraw from the ECHR, it would cause a constitutional crisis within these islands? And on the issue of EU law, it is correct that all EU member states and candidate states are required to be signatories to the Convention. If the Attorney-General is in any doubt about that, he could consult a number of legal academics, including Professor Joanna Douglas-Scott, the Professor of European and Human Rights Law at Oxford University, who has written extensively on this issue. I was going to suggest that perhaps the Attorney-General needed to give the Home Secretary a tutorial on European law. But if the Attorney-General doesn't accept that signatories to the EU have to also be signatories to the Convention, he maybe himself has to have a tutorial.
That's right.
Yes, there is a question. When is this much-promised consultation coming forward? When? Prevarication won't do any longer. When are they bringing it forward? Will it include withdrawal from the ECHR as well as the HRA? The Secretary of State to her new role and say, while of course it's not a prerequisite for her role to be a lawyer, she'll no doubt wish to listen carefully to any legal advice she receives in relation to any proposals to reform the law. Mr Speaker, there's almost universal opposition to repeal of the Human Rights Act in Scotland. This is reflected in the Scottish Parliament and across Scottish civic society. On the 11th of August, I wrote to the UK Government seeking clarification of their plans for so-called reform of the Human Rights Act, following press reports. I've yet to receive a substantive response. At what stage in her plans will the Secretary of State seek to consult with the Scottish Government? And can she confirm that she will listen to and respect the answer? I thank the Secretary of State for her earlier response. If she's been having legal meetings about the Human Rights Act, she will have been advised that human rights are not a reserved matter, and therefore the Scottish Parliament must be consulted regarding any legislation with regard to human rights. During the independence referendum, Scotland was told it was an equal partner in this union. Does she appreciate that to proceed with repeal of the Human Rights Act across the UK would fly in the face of that promise and exacerbate the democratic deficit that already exists in Scotland, where a Tory government we didn't vote for is planning to take us out of the European Union against our will?
I thank the Honourable Lady to her question. I would point out that this was in the Conservative Party manifesto, and we secured a majority at the general election. And as I said, I'll be in touch with the Scottish Justice Minister. I look forward to talking to him on this subject.
Speaker, Scotland's need for different immigration rules is because Scotland faces very different demographic challenges from London and the South East. Yet it's the needs of London and the South East which determine British immigration policy. Why won't the Government exclude Scotland from the net migration target and work with the Scottish Government to pursue policies that are tailored for Scotland's needs? Well, as the Minister very well knows, immigration is still reserved. But I'm interested to hear that he accepts the principle that different rules can apply to different parts of the UK by highlighting differences in the shortage occupation lists. Having accepted the principle, why will he not work with the Scottish Government to pursue other policies that are designed to meet the specific demographic challenges that Scotland faces? I listened very carefully to what the Home Secretary had to say yesterday, but I think, as has already been indicated, her argument that there were no wrongful convictions doesn't hold any water when one realises that the case has collapsed when a decent lawyer revealed collusion on the part of the police. And the absence of deaths at Orgreave is also a red herring. Because, Mr Speaker, is not the real issue here as follows, that when the redactions to the June 2015 IPCC report were revealed, they showed striking similarities between both the personnel and the alleged practices of South Yorkshire Police at Orgreave and Hillsborough. And of course we all know what went on to happen at Hillsborough now. Did the Home Secretary not feel that these striking similarities between personnel and practices at Orgreave and Hillsborough alone justified an independent inquiry, even as an opportunity to increase public trust in the police? And moreover, Mr. Speaker, there's a very important issue raised by Orgreave, and it's this. It's the alleged political interference by the then UK government in operational policing. If political interference from the government took place in operational policing, this would be a deeply troubling matter and one of huge constitutional significance. Did the Home Secretary give this grave accusation consideration as part of her process in leading to her decision yesterday?